By 1964, American rock was ruled by the major record labels. The folk music scene continued into relative obscurity. It was time for rock and roll to be revitalized, a service ultimately rendered not by the American group, but by youthful bands from England. England had followed African American music for decades, particularly traditional New Orleans jazz. There were also groups interested in American folk songs and folk blues. These musical developments, combined with the first wave of imported American rock and roll records, created a youth music movement in Britain. British rock had begun with a pan-English craze called skiffle, which was American and English folk songs played on rustic acoustic instruments such as acoustic guitars, a washboard, and a washtub bass, with songs simple enough to be duplicated by young amateur musicians. The popularity of skiffle began in 1956 with the influence of American folk songs sung by Leadbelly. As the skiffle fad passed away, British youth music developed along regional lines. In Liverpool, former skiffle groups continued to follow American rock and roll, particularly rockabilly as performed by Carl Perkins, Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and others. The Liverpool bands were made up of tough, working-class boys who identified with the insistent beat of rock and roll better than the polite, popular music their parents favored. It is from this setting that the most significant, well-known, and popular British rock band was formed, the Beatles. In London, however, upper-class college students skipped over rock and roll and gravitated towards earthier American rhythm and blues by artists such as Muddy Waters, John Lee Hooker, and Howlin' Wolf. From this setting came the second most significant British rock band, the Rolling Stones. The Beatles had their beginning in 1956 when John Lennon formed the Blackjacks, soon renamed the Quarrymen. The group was originally a skiffle band that also played American rock and roll, and in 1957 Paul McCartney was added to the group, followed by George Harrison. Stu Sutcliffe, a fellow classmate of Lennon's at the Liverpool Art College, was added as a bassist. He was the most musically inept out of all of them, but possessed the rebellious John Dean image the group was trying to put across. Their initial tour of Scotland prompted a name change to the Silver Beatles in deference to Buddy Holly's Crickets, but was dropped in the end to just the Beatles. Drummer Pete Best was added to the Beatles when the group was booked to play in the Rough Club district of Hamburg, Germany in 1960. In Hamburg, the strenuous hours of the Beatles' engagement quickly tightened the group. With the exception of Best, they abandoned the rocker look and adopted their famous hairstyles of a shorter cut with long bangs. The band returned to Liverpool to play in the Cavern Club, a basement bar and former jazz club that had yielded to the local youth's infatuation with rock and roll. The band had made a second trip to Hamburg, where Sutcliffe left the band. Back at the Cavern Club, the Beatles came to the attention of a local record store owner, Brian Epstein, who became their manager. Epstein groomed their music and stage presentation and attempted to get the group a recording contract, eventually signing them with EMI Parlophone. Parlophone was run by George Martin, a well-trained musician and producer who would prove to be an invaluable contributor to the young Beatles' music growth. Martin's first move was to replace drummer Pete Best with an EMI session drummer, Ringo Starr. In 1962, the Beatles would go on to record the singles Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. Local success in recordings, television, and live appearances led to an album release that included covers of existing songs and original songs by Lennon and McCartney. By 1963, the Beatles were the top pop band in England. It was at this time that George Martin and the Beatles now attempted to break into the American rock scene, a feat previous European rock bands did not accomplish. EMI, with great difficulty, finally convinced his American subsidiary, Capitol Records, to release a Beatles single, I Wanna Hold Your Hand. This was followed in February 1964 with the appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, an established CBS television variety program. By the time the Beatles had landed in New York, I Wanna Hold Your Hand had become the #1 hit. 5,000 people had met them at the airport. 70 million watched them on The Ed Sullivan Show. By mid-April in 1964, the Beatles' singles occupied an unprecedented 14 spots on the Billboard's Top 100. In the next 2 years, they released 2 separate films and soundtracks, A Hard Day's Night and Help. The Beatles had covered many styles, rockabilly, rhythm and blues, and sentimental ballads. The songs were generally high-spirited, adolescent, and danceable. The group was nothing revolutionary at the time, but it was remarkable on a couple of counts. Firstly, the Beatles did not present a quaint European parody of American rock, as would have been the case on British television in the late 50s. It was a solid rock and roll band, as valid and as convincing as any American rock band could be. It seemed that even the thick Liverpool accents disappeared when they sang. The second remarkable feature of the Beatles was the prolific songwriting talents of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. The two were near opposites. Lennon was rebellious and dark, more willing to be experimental and idealistic. He served as the rock shouter of the group, and was the better wordsmith of the songwriting team. McCartney, on the other hand, was more conservative and amiable, willing to conform to the norms of the music business. He served as a sweet-voiced balladeer, and was considered to be the better musician of the two. The differences between them resulted in great songs that exhibited a variety of styles and moods. They kept the group successful yet progressive, but ultimately also led to the demise of the band. By 1965, the group was commercially secure enough and musically mature enough to begin experimenting with their music. That spring, Paul McCartney wrote Yesterday, a well-crafted ballad that did not fit into the rock band context. The chord progression was too sophisticated, and the general character was too delicate. Paul intended to record the song as a solo, accompanied by his own acoustic guitar, but producer George Martin suggested an additional accompaniment of string quartet. The suggestion was based more on a chamber music style than the typical lush string section accompaniment of a typical pop album. Yesterday was released as a single in the United States and shot to number 1 on the charts. The group increased its experimentation and demonstrated different contributions by each member of the group and their producer. In late 1965, the epic album Rubber Soul was released. This included Paul's ballad Michelle, unique that it contained 2 different languages, French and English. George used an Indian sitar in the song Norwegian Wood. John's lyrics moved from adolescent romanticism to subjects of social consciousness and universal love, which was inspired by Bob Dylan and other 1960s folk rockers. And with the aid of George Martin, the Beatles also experimented with recording effects that were unattainable in live performances, such as multi-tracking and varying the speed of the tape, such as on the song In My Life. Album experimentation continued onward for the Beatles. In 1966 came the release of the songs Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever, a double-sided single that exemplified the increasingly dichotomy between Lennon and McCartney. Both songs were reminiscent of Liverpool. Penny Lane is charming and bouncy and features a Baroque piccolo trumpet solo, inspired by Bach's second Brandenburg Concerto. It's very typical of McCartney's songwriting style. Strawberry Fields Forever demonstrates John Lennon's fascination with surrealistic lyrics and musical depiction of his increasingly drug-laden lifestyle. 2 contrasting versions were cut, which George Martin combined by careful tape manipulation techniques, creating an eerie sonic landscape. In 1967, the Beatles recorded the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This is what will become to be known as the concept album. The title song begins the album and is reprised toward the end, giving all the songs in the effect a single multi-movement work. There are techniques of multi-tracking, tapes running backwards, and splicing together of tape fragments, and the use of synthesizers. It included brass bands, a string orchestra, a clarinet choir, kazoos, a calliope, and Indian folk instruments. Compositionally, the record contains a variety of styles: Old English music hall, Indian folk music, and straight rock and roll. The track Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds alternates between a gentle triple meter feel on the verse to a rocketing duple feel on the chorus, indicating that the album is intended to be listened to, not danced to. The song Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite was taken almost word for word from an old theater poster. When I'm 64 was McCartney's tribute to his father. In a concept album, the central theme is imposed on the album, and this would be imitated by countless future rock bands in Britain and the United States. On August 27, 1967, Brian Epstein died from a drug overdose. Left without a manager, the Beatles fell victim to their own ineptitude in business and increasing friction between personalities in the group. McCartney's film concept, the Magical Mystery Tour, proved to be a flop. But let's not kid ourselves, that album is hella stacked though. Their self-titled 1968 album, better known as the White Album, shows a fragmented but still successful rock group. The project was an ambitious double record set containing 30 songs. It demonstrated the highest degree of eclecticism and individual expression yet. The White Album marked the first venture of the Beatles' new label, Apple Records, as part of their Apple Quartz Ltd., which dealt with the film, management, and other aspects of the arts and entertainment business. Later that year, the Beatles' cartoon movie Yellow Submarine was released. The singles Hey Jude and Get Back were released from 1968 to 1969 respectively, and were #1 hits. The stellar achievement of Apple Records and the Beatles' best-selling album, Abbey Road, was released in 1969. Among other things, Abbey Road fully legitimized George Harrison as a significant songwriter for the Beatles, with his songs Something and Here Comes the Sun. In 1970, the film Let It Be was released with the accompanying album. The stock of songs for the album had been recorded a year prior, with song selection and production work still to be done. This all came to a screeching halt when the Beatles decided to break up. This led the producer Phil Spector to be brought in to finish the project and get it released. Paul McCartney would release solo albums and create a group called Wings post-1970. John Lennon continued to release solo albums and produce art projects with Yoko Ono until taking a 5-year hiatus before returning to the music industry. Unfortunately, in 1980, he was murdered by a deranged fan, making him the first Beatle to die. The remaining Beatles in the coming decades will go on to release 2 successful projects, an anthology series, and a 27-track CD released in October 2000, named Beatles 1. George Harrison, always known as the Quiet Beatle, became increasingly reclusive, performing occasionally with various bands. After John's murder, Harrison feared his own demise at the hands of a lunatic, and he was not wrong to be paranoid, as a demented fan broke into his home in England in 1999 and stabbed him in the chest several times, but Harrison survived the attack. He wasn't as fortunate in his battle against his longtime smoking habit, and after a long intermittent bout with lung and throat cancer, George passed away in 2001. The Beatles created a wave that many other English groups rode across, and it was the Rolling Stones that had offered something a little bit different than them. Founded by singer Mick Jagger, the group was part of a burgeoning rhythm and blues scene among the London youth in the late 50s and the early 60s. The center of R&B activity was club owner Alexis Korner's band, Blues Incorporated, and the Stones were assembled from musicians who occasionally sat in on Korner's group. The band's name was taken from a song by Chicago R&B star Muddy Waters. By 1963, the personnel of the Rolling Stones solidified to include Mick Jagger, guitarist Keith Richards and Brian Jones, bassist Bill Wyman, and drummer Charlie Watts. It was the Beatles' success that gave them their first big break. Andrew Oldham, a former agent of Brian Epstein, became the Rolling Stones' manager, and an endorsement from Beatle George Harrison got them their first recording contract with Decca Records. Their first significant hit was a cover of the Lennon-McCartney song, I Wanna Be Your Man. But by 1964, it became obvious to the Rolling Stones that the only way to compete with the Beatles was to develop a counter-image to the Fab Four. They wore casual street clothes and ill-kept long hair and presented themselves to the press as rebellious and aloof. Their stage presentation and song content was more sexually explicit. Mick Jagger eventually incorporated footwork used by soul singer James Brown into his concerts. Their music was markedly different from the Beatles as well. It was derivative of Black Chicago rhythm and blues singers from the 40s and 50s, rather than succeeding rockabillys that so influenced the Beatles. Jagger and Keith Richards began a Lennon-McCartney-styled songwriting partnership, which would not bear significant fruit until the release of the song Satisfaction in 1965. But previously in 1964, the Rolling Stones decided to try their hand at invading the United States, with disappointing results. A second US tour later that year proved more successful. Their song Time Is On My Side from their second album, 12x5, reached number 6 in the United States. They released their next single, Satisfaction, and it shot up to number 1 in the summer of 1965. And by December, they released a third album containing the hit Get Off My Cloud. The Stones continued with a string of hit singles through 1967 when the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It was a significant event, and the Beatles once again posed a serious threat to the Rolling Stones' career, a situation they tried to remedy with a similar album project, The Satanic Majesty's Request. It proved a dismal failure. They returned to their more successful R&B format with the song Jumping Jack Flash, and in late 1960, they demonstrated a preoccupation with the occult in Sympathy for the Devil. The decadent lifestyle of the band was catching up with them. Guitarist Brian Jones became so incapacitated by drugs that he was fired from the band. He died in a drug-related accident in 1969. In December of that year, the group gave an ill-planned and disastrous concert at Altamont Speedway near San Francisco. The facility was overcrowded, and Jagger had invited Hells Angels motorcycle gang members to serve as security. I have absolutely no idea how that could have turned out poorly. There were riots, beatings, stabbings, and other mishaps that resulted in the death of 4 people. The Altamont incident established a tradition of destruction and violence at the Stones concerts. Going into 1970s, their albums continued to be outrageous. Their album Sticky Fingers contains sex and drug-related material. Its cover art personifies sexual innuendo. Their collective drug abuse had been an adverse effect on their careers in the mid-70s, but they managed a comeback in 1978. In 1983, they left the Atlantic label for CBS. The members all went to go do solo projects, and the group had occasionally seemed on the verge of a breakup, but they had confounded the industry experts with extremely successful, if infrequent, concert tours. Between the initial British invasion led by the Beatles in 1964, many English groups came and went. Some were light novelty groups, cute, inoffensive, and best forgotten. Others proved to be more musically significant but lacked the staying power of the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. Noteworthy among the lighter groups was Gerry and the Pacemakers, a Liverpool group that rivaled the popularity of the Beatles in England prior to the latter's American debut. They were also managed by Brian Epstein, and their famous track Ferry Across the Mersey rose to number 6 in the United States in 1965. Another honorable mention would be The Animals, a group from Newcastle upon Tyne. They are best known for their track House of the Rising Sun, which was released in 1964. The Kinks were from London and initially attempted a smooth Liverpool Merseybeat sound. Meeting with little success, they began writing their own songs, hardening their sound and beat. Their most popular tracks are You Really Got Me and All Day and All of the Night, both produced and recorded in 1964 and 1965 respectively. The Who were one of the trendiest British R&B bands, representing the mod sector of youthful British fashion. Their music was laden with mod slang, making it hard for them to have mainstream success. The hallmark that saved the group's popularity proved not to be a musical feature, but a theatrical one. In a concert mishap, guitarist Pete Townshend found that he got more reaction from the audience smashing his guitar than playing it. Soon afterward, instrument destruction became an integral part of the act, with all members of the band participating. Its intensity still made markability elusive. The Who, just like the Rolling Stones, represented a rebellious side of rock music. However, if the Stones were smug and hedonistic, The Who were downright angry. The Who's music better matched the emotional tone of American youth in the last half of the 1960s, when the escalating Vietnam conflict threatened their very lives. At the same time, The Who was thoroughly British in its presentation, a vivid icon of English mod fashion. They represented a maturity in the development of the British rock invasion, where British fashion and music asserted its own originality and no longer had to pay homage to American culture. British rock was an exotic novelty in the early 60s, but its power as an influence in popular music would be ultimately undeniable.